Okay. So just to recall something we decided in our last meeting, we're going to try to keep it shorter than usual, right? And try to have like smaller segments rather than 4-hour meetings where people are dying at the end. So just so we can keep kind of track of time as well. So just to go back, this is, didn't want to share the screen, but didn't want to like do the. So this is the presentation I started doing a couple of weeks ago, right? We pretty much focused on in our discussion, I think, on these two initial points here. Let me just do something. Yeah, like we basically focused on these 2 points last time. I can just mention them again really quickly, and then we left for today to try to go over these 3 other kind of topics that were raised in discussions we had in the last couple of months, right? I'm kind of assuming this sort of kind of history of the research thus far, right? I think we had some first meetings, a couple of like very early on, that were very kind of trying different things. I remember the first meeting I was talking to Raquel, and then is about representation and capital. Then we had meetings on category theory. Then we talked about integrated information theory. We were trying a bunch of stuff. Then I think once Dennis and I started working on the primer, and we had some presentations on Badiou and Marx and things like this, a lot of the presentations started getting closer together. Like there was this one on Karatani and organization. Then Caron presented on like this philosophy of language take on capital. We presented stuff on primer. Then even the stuff on physics had clear connections with those ideas. So it was like a more vectorialized situation. Everything seemed to be going in a similar direction. Then I think there was a third moment, which I think is the one that is closing now, because after this set of presentations, we had a couple of more free-form ones. We tried to see if we could integrate linear logic and some of the stuff that Pedro and Caron are discussing. We weren't really sure, I think, how to do it. We started discussing these new texts on categorical cybernetics, right, that are like recent, out of the oven. And we tried some stuff, and I think we had some ideas, but it was very kind of all over the place. So the idea with these 2 presentations were I watched those meetings again. I looked at my notes and I saw which texts we mentioned in that period. So it was this behavioral meteorology text, not in a meeting, but through the WhatsApp group. We mentioned this resource sharing machine text. Those stuff on cybernetics, like this recent take on cybernetics, which is this reparametrizable optics stuff. And I found some text on categorical treatment of experiments that seemed interesting. So I tried to organize all these ideas and see if they don't start looking like a research direction, like this could lead to a second kind of sequence of more concatenated debates and parts of our research and so on. So that's kind of the purpose of the meeting, right? Of this presentation. So what I did last time is that I took Logics of Rose Badiou's text, and I kind of tried to show what we did thus far, and I used these 2 markers for this. The first is that we wrote this text called Primer on Political Phenomenology that kind of covers this part of Badiou's book, which is, let's say, the objective part, the part that describes a world, describes this sort of transcendental analysis. We used Badiou's framework to kind of make Karatani's ideas more robust, make Karatani's ideas less about a very weak idea of exchange and more about a stronger idea of organization. So we kind of mixed Badiou, Bogdanov, and Karatani into one monster. And weirdly enough, we showed in this text that this approach is broader in terms of power or expressivity than Marx's approach, because we were able to reconstruct practically all categories of volume 1 using this approach. And there's still a lot to say that was not said in Capital. So it kind of demonstrates that it is richer than what we find in Capital. So this map here is good simply because it shows that these are the aspects of Badiou that we kind of covered. This is where our engagement with Marx kind of happened, and there is some stuff that's beyond this that is already included. And these are the stuff that we didn't cover, right? Which concerns political organization, novelty, strategy, creation of something common. So the more, let's say, prescriptive, active side of politics, right? Yeah, so then I try to show that there are therefore 3 lines of research we can take from this. The first is to continue examining this added layer that we added to Capital. So we added a bunch of new ideas that kind of appear together with Marx's description of capitalist relations. We could continue to explore them, right? We could go further into describing capitalist society. So use these enriched ideas to describe things that are not capital. That would be the first. So state, communities, how do we talk about power? How do we talk about, I don't know, whatever, right? Things that are not, let's say, within the subset of capitalist mode of exchange. Or we can develop further our understanding of capitalist relations in or capitalist social formations today. Or we can go further into the parts of this project that we didn't develop, which is how do we talk about collective organizations using this same framework? How do we talk about strategy, about this idea of an ecology of organizations and things like this? How do we move towards that direction, right? Not to go into detail, I just separated a bunch of topics that fall under each of these kind of directions. But the idea is that this text that we were talking about in our last kind of sequence, they mostly fall in this third category of continuing to expand the project and not enriching what we already have, right? With the exception of this idea of behavioral meteorology, which in some sense falls more into this space here, most of these ideas about optics and this and that, they should help us, or the idea is that they might help us move towards this inclusion of the theory of political organization into this framework, right? So this, I think, is the slide that we spent most time talking about last time. Right, the idea is that we have now a description of capitalist social formations from the standpoint of objective phenomenology. What does objective phenomenology mean? It means that it's a description of social worlds that are best seen from the standpoint of certain of its own objects, right? So we kind of, I'm also going through this again just because Rafael wasn't here before. It's just a way of kind of summarizing what we've been doing. My impression, I'm not sure if you feel the same way, Dennis, but I think that one of the merits of this primer on political phenomenology is that it makes a very strong case to the idea that you only see capitalist relations from the standpoint of certain objects in that world. So what is usually treated in terms of a theory of fetishism, that some relations are kind of mystified behind the relations between things, we are actually claiming a sort of weird perspectivism in which you're saying that the perspective of the commodity is the one that actually sees the world in an intelligible way. So it's not a mystification, it's actually the fact that only certain social structures can see certain logics, right? and this applies to other things. So the sovereign or a sovereign structure can see things about the state that a citizen cannot, right? Or you can only see it when you treat yourself as a citizen rather than as an individual, for example. Then you can see some things become intelligible about state structures. Or when you look at the world from the standpoint of a family or from the standpoint of a group or a community, then some things about the world of reciprocity and affinity becomes intelligible. So you need to choose the correct eye to see the world, right? And different worlds appear to different eyes, so to speak. So we're now looking for a theory of organization that has that same premise, that only some things are only intelligible from the perspective of certain structures, and you can't really see anything from any organization, right? It's interesting because Althusser had this quip, this one-liner that was very famous. He says, you cannot see everything from everywhere, meaning you have to take a position, like a class position. I think that we're doing actually a second twist on his idea, because it's not enough to be positioned in a certain way. If you're not organized in a certain way, you cannot see everything, right? So it's not enough to, let's say, take the position of the proletariat. The world will still be a mess that you cannot understand, right? So there is some sort of assemblage, some sort of way of composing parts of the world that makes that new object a possible sensor to structures in the world.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, we're aiming for something where you can't simply just say, now I'm going to take this position and now I can see everything from this position. It cannot be like an abstract taking of that position. You need something that, for lack of a better term, like it costs you something to see. Like organization is work, right? It takes work. It takes there's a certain like precariousness to it, and that is necessary to be able to sense certain things. Not simply saying like, now I'm in this position, I have solidarity with this movement, therefore I now see what is going on. It's not that simple, right?
And in order to say this, this clarifies something for me that I hadn't really understood, because one of the ways we started talking about this was that we wanted to show that you can unify the look at organizations and at economies in such a way that ultimately you can look at organizations economically and at economies organizationally, even if you keep the differences, because some are large, some are small, some are done in this way, some are in the other. But that statement already makes the economic in the organizational clear, right? That it costs something to see something.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that might even be a definition of what economy means. Like, an economy is precisely a social system where it costs something to see something about it, right? The very intelligibility of your place in the world is tied together with some costs of occupying this position, occupying that position, accumulating capital in order to see something, So I think it gives economy a bit of an epistemic issue, right? There is something epistemic about money. It helps you to see something about the world, right? Or commodities. And it gives a sort of cost measure for organization. Like, it's costly to be able to sense certain things about the world. It's not given for you for free. You cannot take it just by abstractly saying, now I'm on the left, therefore now see things different. That's not true, right? So
yeah, I mean, and not only to say that money is the only thing that you can pay, right? You can pay with other things than money, and that's really where the novelty comes in. Like, what are the other ways you can pay to sense things? Because also there's different things you cannot sense with money that we're trying to get around, right?
Guys, just one second. No? Tá bom. Yeah, so under this premise right? That we want a theory of organization that keeps to all these ideas. We kind of divided the sort of tasks in these three terms here, right? Because if the compositional structure of organizations determines what differences make a difference to it, meaning if you want to say that depending on how you're structured, the logic changes, right? It determines what makes a difference. And again, I think that more and more it's becoming clear to me that this is not a theoret. I mean, it's a theory about something that is not theoretical, right? There's a difference between theorizing that something exists and sensing the difference that it makes. And we're trying to talk about compositional structure affecting your capacity to sense that something exists and not to theorize about it. Like as I gave the example last time, you can imagine like a commune inside of Brazil, and it lives off the land and so on. It has a theory about global capitalism or about the state and so on, but it might not have any, things might happen in the world that make no difference to it. So it doesn't sense those structures, right? In a way that, I don't know, the national, the central bank senses, it's literally, it might not have a theory. It doesn't even have a good theory of why some differences are making a difference to it, but it doesn't need the good theory because it's actually perceiving that difference, right? It affects meaningful indicators and so on. So that means that we are connecting a compositional look at things, how things are composed together, what is a part of what, how things are interrelated and so on, and an informational perspective, right? What counts as a difference? What is information? What is noise? And so on, right? But if the informational structure of an organization depends on the composition, this structure also is determined by the ways that this organization interacts with the environment. So it's not simply information coming from nowhere. It's information coming from an environment that reacts to what you do. So this information dimension is actually connected with an interactional one. So you can say that ultimately there is how you are organized, what is intelligible, and what you're capable of doing are three connected domains, right? And since we are concerned with political interaction and political information and political composition, it's not enough to simply be, let's say, a company. A company, a small little business in the street, it has dealing with suppliers, customers. It can sense things that individuals cannot, but it cannot sense things that a mega corporation can, in the way that it, influences prices, creates monopolies, and does this and does that. Like a mega corporation is able to sense things that a small business cannot. But in either one of the two cases, no one is concerned with making differences that didn't make a difference start to matter. And that's where politics comes in, right? As we try to show in the primer, you can think of a capitalist enterprise as a laboratory, as an experiment, but it's constrained in the sense that all the novelty that it takes from cooperation, from materials, from the land, need to be compatible with the value form. You cannot just bring any novelty up, right? Let's say if workers managing themselves and abolishing the structure of the firm, actually is something possible, it won't be desirable just because it was found out that it's possible. So there is a constraint, and this fourth part here is trying to show what we would need to move beyond the constraint, because this interactive dimension, if it's political, it means that we are trying to produce something new and to find ways to make this novelty consist beyond its own local revelation, right? So this interactional needs to go back with the compositional, meaning we interact with the world as an organization to find ways to recompose something that wasn't composed in that way before, not to simply reproduce the way things were already done, right? You don't just want to know the world as it is. You want to know the world as it is and also make it something else. So when you combine all of this, you could say that this becomes a sort of experimental process. You can definitely kind of see how one thing becomes the other, because when like experiments are structures where the composition of an instrument determines what sort of differences it can sense. Well, but the space of all possible differences you can sense is then constrained by the way that you will interact with the environment in that experiment, right? You're gonna do something specific to see a specific reaction. And you don't simply want that process of interaction through an instrument that makes something intelligible to circulate around statements we already knew. You wanted to confirm statements that we were not sure about, right? So it adds this sort of something new into the picture. So we get these three things here. They describe a very general, non-scientific, it's much broader than scientific, but a general idea of what being experimental could mean in a consequential sense, right? Which we're just trying to understand what that is, but still. So we have this sort of three kind of arrows connecting these three things, right? The question of how does the material composition constrain and shape what makes a difference, right? The question of what interventions in an environment, how are interventions going to this environment, and how are the responses that we get back connected to this intelligibility, right? And the question of how can these interactions be structured so that things that were previously unformed or non-intelligible or didn't make a difference now make consistent differences and can be transmitted, replicated, built upon, and so on. I think it's nice to see that this triad here is not like our solution to the capitalist problem. Like capitalism works exactly with these three things according to our current idea in the primer. It's just that you could almost say that this thing here, this last arrow here is limited, right? You will only make interactions and recompose things under the condition that the product of this recomposition is at least trivially preserving value. But it's not like we're adding a new principle to talk about organization. This principle and these ideas, they're kind of already at stake when we're talking about capitalist production and other forms of social reproduction in capitalist formations, right? So I'm just going to skip these two here because we covered them last time. But the idea was basically, we read this text called Behavioral Meteorology, which is very similar to what Badiou does in his Logics of Worlds. It seems like it can allow us to do something that we're missing right now, which is a way to talk about the social structures in a way that it's not like we're talking about substantial objects, or at least we don't let that possibility kind of appear as an interpretation. That we're talking about an object is, let's say, a certain space of constraints, right? To be in a capitalist society is to be able to do certain things and not to be able to do other things. And to have the case where if you do something, something else is also implied or implicated, or that something needs to be done so that something else can be done, and so on. So there is this idea that we could redescribe what we call social objects, right? In terms of the constraints that we have. And I think that that's nice on the one hand, because it brings us closer to a topic and an approach that is dear to Caron and to Pedro, which is a more normative take on actions and rules and so on. And at the same time, it might help us to have a theory of power as a sort of social constraint that is very complicated, very complex theory, because we can talk about social, like since our current idea of a social object is that it is a product of the capitalist transcendental, the state transcendental, and the community transcendental, and it's a mixture of all these things. You can talk about what it means for what is the logic of state power, the logic of a power of affinity or reciprocal power, the logic of power in the terms of value, then what it means to combine two of these constraints like this, and finally what it means to take all of the three together at the same time. So it can lead to a very complicated and complex theory of power as well. So that could be interesting. I know Yasha was interested in looking further into this. I'm not going to go into like the parallels we saw between that text and logics of worlds, and all the difficulties we would have in understanding better this and going further with the research. I'm just going to skip this. Then the other thing we started talking about last time, which actually after our meeting, I was a bit frustrated. Like I realized it's not as on point as some of the texts and presentations that I saw on this suggested. But resource sharing machines is actually a text by the Sophie Lipkind, and she's developing it together with a bunch of guys in this applied category theory group. And they're interested in a very, very profound problem that connects a lot with what we are interested in, but they're focusing on something which I don't think is our focus. So they are trying to understand how to connect what we call two flavors of open dynamical systems. The flavors are undirected resource-based systems, meaning, for example, things that have no direction. So you can have something like this and this two things, and they share something in the middle here, and therefore they have some common resource here. They affect each other in an undirected way. It's not really like good to think in terms of communication. Like the example that they give is something like, when people are speaking, they are sharing some mass of air, and the air pressure that's shared and that is making that mass of air vibrate and change in certain patterns is kind of determining who hears something loud, who hears something very low, but it's undirected. It's not the standpoint of communication as an input and an output, a receiver and a sender. It's just some resource that we share, right? And they want to couple that analysis with the analysis of machine-like systems, which have like inputs and outputs, and show how these two things go together. So you see, there is something compositional in the sense of resource-based kind of systems that share parts of themselves, right? So like my respiratory system shares a mass of air with the respiratory and vocal system of other people. That's like a physical analysis of some system and an environment. It doesn't concern inputs and outputs. The air is not the output or the input or anything, right? It's just part of that clump of systems. But the communicative structure where I'm saying, Renzo, blah, 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 like I'm actually the sender and you're the receiver of a message. It's coupled with the mass of air. It uses the mass of air, relies on it, on its composition, but it adds a different dimension, right? So you can see that there's something in this that connects compositional analysis and informational analysis, like the analysis from the standpoint of how systems share parts of one another to what sort of information circuit you can have on top of that, right? So for example, if one of us was not sharing any sort of common medium, was like isolated completely with no way of, kind of accounting for a common base, even if it's very fragmented, like the air in my room is making vibrate the sensor in the microphone that makes the air in one of you guys' room vibrate in your ear, right? But it's a common resource made of a bunch of things. If there was no such thing, well, you couldn't function as a receiver or a sender. So there is constraints on information coming from composition or from this resource perspective. But they are not really interested in the question, what composition allows for what difference? They are more interested, like the people who wrote these papers, they're more interested in how do I look at these two things together? Which is interesting in itself, like the idea that, we have some finite resource and this machine runs on that finite resource. So while I keep track of the functions that see the change, for example, in some circuit-like structure, I can also keep track of the material that is circulating in that circuit, for example, something like this, right? So it's not exactly the sort of thing that we're looking for. Like this is the sort of the two models, right? X and W, they share some common resource. Y and Z have some common resource. It's different from, let's say, the directed arrows of how they interact here. And you can have this sort of, what they're trying to show is that if you have undirected arrows, like these red ones, that talk about the shared resources that, for example, W and X have and Y and Z have, and you have this directed arrows of W is sending something to X, you can actually have consistent laws of composition. You can actually compose, box together, nest, unnest, do those tensor products and all those other operations on these things, and it's consistent. It's a really cool result, but it's not exactly focusing on the issue of why is it that if you compose in some way, some differences will not, let's say, you won't be able to constitute yourself as the receiver of some output, right? For example, something like this. It's a slightly different question. Like, I think it's the question, politically is the issue of what sort of, for example, social composition a group needs to have so that, for example, the presence of the police is a sensible difference. It's not like a group of 5 white men meeting, the police car going through in front of the house makes no difference. Like, it's not about theoretically, it makes a difference, but it doesn't make a difference like in the level of sensibility, right? The sort of transcendental aesthetics we're talking about. So there is a correlation between how things are composed and what makes a difference. And that's, let's say, a very hands-on, practical kind of epistemology of organization, right? The sense of this, it's almost not there's definitely a more kind of fashionable way to talk about this, because it's like if you're organized in a way, you're like an organ that can be excited by certain things, right? So if you like Twitter philosophy, you could make it fashionable, I think. But you see the problem, like this is not what these guys are directly dealing with. Like, they talk about it in a way. I think that they bring a lot of tools perhaps that we could explore. Like, I made some correlations here. And they also use like these lenses that we're interested in from the the optics stuff, but they never really try to spell out this sort of morphogenetic kind of problem of organization. How is it that acquiring a certain form will connect you with certain things? And ultimately, I'm more and more convinced that Badiou is actually the guy who went the furthest. Like, he actually has a formal theory of how to talk about this. Like, parts of things can only compose with certain other parts of things, and therefore you're taking a perspective, and therefore you're going to be affected by certain things. He actually has a theory on this, and I haven't found like a technical paper moving in that direction. I don't think that this paper that I suggested actually does this, and this is what I added here last time, right? That it focuses on something else, but it says little about the things that we were talking about before. So I think it's more in the air how to approach this than at first I thought. So
let me just jump in, because I feel more optimistic. I mean, I think resource sharing machines, it is nice for the questions of what we talked about, the multi-layer transcendental seems to be a mixture of this kind, right? Like, where you have resources, like in a community, but then some of those resources are caught up in the circuit of capital, right? So you have the supply chains, or kind of this production process that's like more like a directed machine, whereas resources are more like the natural, but also community itself, right? The community itself is kind of a resource.
Yeah, I can see like an ecological redescription of capitalist production using this. Like
exactly,
we already use the same formalism to talk about production with those kind of operas, right?
Operas, yeah.
Yeah, but they're all like, you have labor power, you have means of production, they combine, they form something, blah, blah, right? It would be interesting to imagine that you add to this kind of oriented lines where the product is here and you have all these commodities coming here. You could imagine like adding like actually making explicit all the resource dependent arrows, right? Because just because something was passed on to the product at the level of resources, there is no passing along, right? It just reverberates everywhere. So it could be a really interesting tool in that direction, like definitely, I think. But it's still a slightly different problem, right? It's interesting, but I think it's a different problem, no? Like, do you think that really has to do with this, like added statement here? Right, interaction between material composition and information. It's not really what it's that interested in, right? Like only in a very specific way.
Yeah. Not in the sense of like you can now sense something different. I think, I don't know where it fits. Maybe this resource sharing machines maybe fits better with 4 or 2. Yeah, like.
Yeah, I have the impression that like in this slide here, I suggested that right, that all these papers, they all concern the questions that we're looking for to expand here. But I think that the behavioral meteorology and the resource sharing machines, they are probably just ways of enriching the description, right? You want to enrich our talk of capitalist social formations, for example, looking at the ecological costs, energetic costs, like the fact that it's all based on physical systems and there's entropy and there's this and that, you probably would use this, right? So like probably ecology, the ecological perspective could come here and the power perspective could come in here, but they're enriching the description. They're not like answering questions that we need to move this way, you know?
Yeah, well, I don't know. So behavioral meteorology could be related to what is a body.
Yeah, but don't you feel like it has to do with political organization and so on? Simply because it already offers like a general grammar to talk about both capital, state, nation, blah, 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 and political organizations. Like it's like redescribing these basic categories here, right?
Yeah.
But I agree. And actually, if we have time, I added a bonus text that I think makes the behavioral meteorology actually very active, like an active research line to talk about organization and experimentation, in fact. But yeah, so I'll try to get there in a bit. I think it could be promising, but like the big thing, I think in my opinion, the thing with the largest potential for kind of setting us on a specific new course, I think is the stuff in this study here. It's very, in my opinion, like it's a very personal thing. I'm very ambivalent about it as a kind of tool we can use because it's being developed to bring, like it's like we're going into a territory that is very near our research, but it's mostly committed with other things, and then trying to bring something useful to us, because these guys are working on this thing they call categorical cybernetics, and they're interested in formalizing machine learning, algorithms, things like this. So if you just like take what they're doing at face value, we're moving away from, I think, what we're working on towards something that is actually not really the same thing. They're very much interested in like feedback, learning, machine learning, and things like this. And by cybernetics, they kind of mean taking a look at control system theory, game theory, machine learning. Those are the objects that they want to treat. And there's definitely something missing in all of these. When they're not really good images for what political thinking, political action is like. Political action is not like an algorithm that you're applying multiple times and getting results and then learning from it. Like that's a very simplified version of the sort of more experimental side of things. And I think though it's nice to be able to explain why it's not the same, and I think that they also help with this, in which way an organization is not just a control system with a feedback based on its principles. It tries something out, then if it gets an answer, it does this. If it doesn't, it does something else. Or why is it not just a game with strategies? Why is political strategy not like game theory, right? And also, why is it that political thinking is not reducible to a sort of cognitive simulation or computation of information about the world? Like those are really good questions to talk about as well. So the machinery that they're dealing with, I think it's very interesting. Sometimes it's the closest thing I've ever seen to somebody discussing Bogdanov's ideas, like that duality between optics and combs. So systems and environments, they're actually built with the same machinery. It's just a matter of perspective. There's a bunch of stuff that is very similar, but it has this sort of, since their objective is a bit different, you need to be careful, in my opinion. So this categorical cybernetics, as they call it, describes systems that are bidirectional. So they interact with an environment. So they do something directed to the environment, and then they get a response under certain parameters, which can themselves be transformed. So you acted under certain assumptions. When you get the response, you can change your assumptions, change your parameters, and then act again, right? And they managed to describe very complex ways of interacting with an environment using pretty much the same machinery we use in the primer and all the discussions we've been having, the same kind of basic theory, which is category theory that Badiou used in Logics of Growth. So it's all in the same kind of family of concepts, right? They have a way of defining what a sensor is, what an environment is, and what agents are. And they managed to unify in one sole kind of theory all these different areas. I mean, they don't manage to do all of this. They're trying. They're like early on. We're picking up like the beta versions. They still haven't released it the full version. So it has a lot of stuff, but I think that, and I wanted just to mention how they treat it in a bit. But I think that one thing that I was talking to Dennis the other day that I think is a really good kind of slogan is that what is the difference between cybernetics and what Bogdanov used to call technology, and why is that relevant to us? I think that you could define technology as cybernetics plus composition, right? Cybernetics is interested in, let's say, treating the interaction between systems and parts of systems in terms of differences. But it's not interested in the question of how the composition of the system conditions what makes a difference. That's not a cybernetic question. It's not a question of cybernetics. And that's the question we began from, right? Depending on how you are organized, you are sensitive or sensible to certain things. The theory of being sensitive to things could be the theory of cybernetics broadly understood. But we don't want to focus on that. We want to focus on the conditions for things to make a difference. And that's not the object of cybernetics. So technology would be adding this preliminary question of the condition of possibilities for a game, the condition of possibilities for a control system with an environment, right? How do these things need to be composed so that interaction is possible in this way rather than that way, right? So that's where this compositional and what we call the organizational comes in. And that's not really what they're focused. They say assume a system and its environment. Now let's see how we can describe this thing playing out and the thousands of ways that it can interact, change itself, classes of strategies, classes of ways of being of learning new things. But it assumes something which is not really its interest to explore, which is that compositional thing, which is, again, the thing that not even that resource sharing machine text is actually addressing. It doesn't seem like none of these texts are addressing this issue directly.
The question of composition, I think we're maybe approaching it differently from them, because they also are talking about composition, right? But in
definitely.
These wiring diagrams and these like lenses.
But it's always the inverse, right? It's always the question of what compositions this thing can do, and not what compositions this thing relies on, right? Like we're asking, how does it need to be organized for some difference to make a difference? And they are saying, look at this differential machine. Look at the system. You can compose it with different systems, and then it creates a third one. And you can compose it in this other way. And you can decompose it in this and that way, and we can track the changes, right? It seems like you have the basic concepts, and they are compositional, like they abide to category theory's kind of basic ways of composing parts and objects and so on, right? It's not really like this conditioning issue thing, slightly different. I'm not sure. Do you think it's different? I mean, I'm confused now.
Yeah, I don't know. Does it seem like we're talking about the conditions to even become a compositional object? So what are the conditions to start to compose? Whereas they're talking about already having composable pieces and then seeing what happens when you compose them.
Yeah, because for example, and this is why I think ultimately this project is, in my opinion, a Marxist project, because the longest text I know about composing stuff in such a way that suddenly you capture information you didn't capture before is Marx's theory of value. Like that's a whole theory of, if you take some objects rather than others, and if they are placed in a structure rather than in a different one, then money will be able to express value, right? It's like literally a morphogenetic theory of how some object in the world can come to express a more structural, invisible quality that directly couldn't, right? There is something, weirdly enough, there is something like in all the different moments of the theory of money, then price, all those things, we already saw that they have like they change objects so that they sense different things about the social structure, right? It's hard to find other texts and authors that had the kind of a sixth sense to that sort of project, even if Marx wasn't really thinking about this so explicitly, right? But I mean, I think now I understand better what you said, Dennis, but I would then, perhaps we could make the added detail that it's not that we are talking about something pre-compositional, like before it composes, but it's before it composes as what it is, right? Like parts of my eye are composable as cells, molecules, or whatever, but only once they are organized in some way do they compose with the world as, a sensor for light does, right? It's only after some morphogenetic process does it acquire a form that allows it to make some things intelligible, right?
Yeah. It's almost like we're talking about where the ports come from.
Exactly. Where does the parts come from?
Yeah, because there might be some internal, like an eye has some internal structure, but at what point does it? I mean, that structure is somehow co-evolving with the outside world, right?
Yeah, and it's a weird process where, of course, you have composition before, but once you cross a certain threshold, now that inner composition is below the relevant resolution, and that thing can be treated as a new unit, like a new identity, right?
Yes.
So it is something complicated, I think, and it's not really, again, what they are focused on, but if you look at what they are doing, you can see that they're doing a lot of stuff that is interesting for us. So I just added here very briefly, like the four big concepts or the four big kind of schematics that they produce. They start from this concept of lenses, and there is a nice text called "Lenses for Philosophers." You can find online. It's a short blog post that explain why they started realizing that this thing here, which is actually a structure that comes from computer science, is just like a kind of a structure for classifying, right, and updating systems. You have some states, right, some situation you are going to view. I think this is the view function. You save the state that you originally had when you apply this view function. It gives you some output, and then when you are taking back this response, the updated thing actually combines the updated, the effect of the update plus the state that it was in, right? So it saves these two things here. So it was something very specific, and then they realized that, well, but this actually, you can treat this categorically, and it gives you a sort of theory of a feedback theory in categorical terms, right? Then you have this move from this first idea of lenses to the second idea of optics, and it's nice that it's a feedback structure that, due to these contingent reasons, comes with this idea that it allows something to be seen, right? But this move here, only the first thing that they did is to free this state from being the perfect memory of the initial state of this system that viewed something and updated. So you, rather than just saving the memory and then adding it to the update, you actually have what they call a residual, which is you separate. You can have this sort of, this does something, and the feedback from this will be coupled with some information, but not necessarily the information is the state, the original state that went into the function. It can be something else. Then they call this the residual, and they have a separate class for this. Then they have this idea of, well, but we want to look at the structure of this residual information that was added to the feedback to give it, let's say, some semantic value, right? And you can then have what they call this para-optics, which is just, it actually has a category for these residuals, which is a category of parameters. So I'll just erase all the craziness I'm doing here. So you can have, let's say, some parameter refining this function. And when you have this propagation back, you know the parameter, and you have some sort of observable state, right? Something you can know now about the effect of what you did. So you have this sort of other category of the parameter, kind of parameter space, and the sort of outcome of applying that parameter, or some information about what happened, right? And they separate this. And then they did a third thing, which is to say, well, but you can imagine the space of all parameters and this sort of, actually this is inverted here, this is cute. And these responses as being affected by changes themselves. So you can have, let's say, some structure. I don't know, for example, have a strategy. You have a strategy and you act on it. You see the reward, and then you decide that you're going to go with a different strategy, and then it will give you a different reward. And you can actually track this transformation from a set of strategies to a different set of strategies, right? Or from some type of parameters that you would do in that case to new parameters you will do in the new case. And once they formalized all these ideas, which you see is pretty much just a way of adding this red structure on top of a feedback loop, right? Pretty much. They had this original feedback here. Oh, shit. Yeah, they had this original feedback, and they add this loop here, which is a sort of parameter space for what did I do and how do I interpret what happened, right? The response. And they treat that space as a separate thing that can itself be transformed and so on. So once they have this, it's a very general machinery that they show that you can specify and formalize to the point that you can describe using these things here, depending on what you add here on top. This can be the sort of basic schematics for a machine learning process. Or depending on what you add here and what these functions are, it can be a game with rewards, players, strategies, and so on. Or it can be a learner, or it can be different things, right? So if you look very simply, what you have is, again, this sort of system here. It has what they call this do function that takes an initial state, right, to something else. Then you have a propagate function that takes this continuation back to be the new initial state, right? You have the environment in which this state is happening. And now they call an agency this space of parameters that gave some information on this function and took some information from the response, right? And then you can have a whole theory of different types of agency based on how this different circuit happens. The really cool thing that made this seem more than just, let's say, a kind of redescription of feedback structures and the fact that they have knobs and parameters is that not only is this very flexible in what you can fill in each of these things, but it also has this nice thing here, encapsulated by this pretty drawing. We're just trying to show the fact that this structure, which is the optic, it can be turned into the environment in which an optic is included, right? It's a bit, I don't know how to stop the image, but so I'll go back here. Like the fact that if you look at this thing here, I'm not sure if we can change the color of this. Yeah. If you look at this thing here, you can redescribe it as this thing here. So you can invert the position. So the thing that looks like the environment, which is giving an input to a system that then does this and just goes back and so on, you can invert the description and look at the whole environment as a system with that other system as its environment, right? So the formalism is the same, which is, again, very Bogdanovian, because for Bogdanov, the idea that you have an organization like acting on its environment, right? And the environment resisting labor. It's a perspective thing, right? When he writes something like you have like a organization here, an environment here, and this is trying to do something this way, and this is a resistance, and this is labor. He says, well, but this is actually the same thing as saying that you have this environment here, and you have this organization resisting it as it tries to labor on the organization. It's a perspectival problem, right? So you have a very similar intuition in this formalism. It doesn't make a substantial distinction between environment and system. And why is that interesting? Because one of, I think, the most profound insights we had recently is that if we want to think as the passage from organizations, political organization, to new economical principles, that's pretty much the passage we're talking about. Imagine, it's a difference between saying, I have a capitalist world like this, shit. Right, a world built with like all objects here in the initial conditions are objects of this structure. And they're going through some system here, some organization that is interacting with these objects, right? So it would look like this is the social formation, and this is an organization, and this is an economy. And you could ask under which conditions you could invert the order and have this organization count, or this system of many, many organizations become the environment under which objects that are like this are now constrained, right? You can ask under which conditions becoming a capitalist or remaining a capitalist becomes too costly because most of the world structure is no longer cohesive to that. The environment resists it, right? So we can imagine like a very different way of talking about moving from like talking about the transition problem from capitalist to socialism in terms of a move from system to environment, or collection of organizations to the composition of an environment of constraints. It looks cohesive with Bogdanov. We already know it's cohesive with Karatani. And yeah, it seems very cool, like if this works. So the theory is very complicated, in fact, and I think that it's the one that has most papers. There are like hundreds of papers already on this. I think that the connections with Badiou are there, but it's not easy to make. It's mostly taking what Badiou calls points, this idea of making local investigations that give you some result as to whether that investigation connects with some new process or if it doesn't. And the way that these investigations can compose together, right? This is how he talks about points and the new topology. It would require us to unpack that idea, make it more refined and have more nuance. But it seems to me like it's very promising. Like in my opinion, from these papers and these research directions, is the one with most promising kind of effects. As I said, like there are many, many problems. We would need to actually understand what the hell these things are, which is no simple matter. They are mostly tailored to formalize games and algorithms, where relations between how you observe and how you intervene are limited in specific ways. I don't think there are any texts yet on how to connect reparameterized space, how agents can be composed together. I think Renzo made some nice points recently about the fact that this could be a nice way to think about strategy. We don't know much about how to talk about this shift, where you have this thing they call a comb, right? And a system in the middle, and how, under which conditions is it meaningful to invert the description? We have actually a good idea on this, I think, because if you think that all objects here are made of, like, let's just simplify really quick, they're dominated by C and they have A and B modes of exchange as well, state and community. And this is a little machine for adding a new mode, D, to A, B, and C, right? So this is what happens here. There comes a moment where describing the world with these three vectors makes for an impoverished description of the world, and describing objects as built with these four transcendentals makes for a richer description. At that moment, it makes more sense to talk about a world where objects have all four, and talk about systems that, for example, reduce. They don't want to take into consideration free association. It's like they are the ones having to labor to disconsider it, right? So we could actually have a meaningful description of under which conditions this inversion here is meaningful. So that's cool. There seems to be very, Caron is not here, nor Pedro, but they are very interested, I know, in linear logic, which is this really cool development in contemporary logic that talks about dialogical reasoning, talks about constructing reasons through interaction. And the fact is that the same machinery used for constructing what we are talking about now, optics, with this sort of, you send this, X sends something here and it goes to Y, and then a response sends it back and goes to S, and something is saved here. This little machine is the basis for this thing, Brazilian logician, in fact, called Valéria de Paiva, wrote, called the dialectical interpretation, which is one of the interpretations of linear logic. So it's very connected, in fact. Like, ultimately, they kind of describe this feedback as if in the first run, I'm the system, and this is the environment. I output something. But then in the second moment, it's like there is another system that is outputting something into me. So at first, I'm the system, and what's outside here is the environment. But in the back propagation, they are the system, and I'm the environment for them. And then you invert. So this is like a dialogical thing. So it's all kind of connected in interesting, complicated ways. Again, makes for very interesting research. And ultimately, there is this other problem, which is how do you connect this discussion of parameters, sensors, agents, to these ideas more connected to scientific experiments like instrumentation, observation, hypotheses, and so on, right? Which is what we would need to talk about experimentation as one of the things that is formalizable with this. Because if you look at it, it's kind of, you can kind of see it, right? If you imagine that the space of parameters is something like the space of hypotheses, or the space of what, in one of the papers that I wanted to comment if we have time, they call the information model. And this defines, I say, the space of interactions you're willing to do. Well, you interact and you observe, right? And depending on your hypothesis and your informational model, you define how you interact and you interpret your observation. And the fact that this here is different from the environment at large is because you need to compose the system in some specific way so that it can interact and observe in specific ways. It's not the environment. Experiments is not throwing things out there with no means of controlling minimally what you're interacting with, right? So there is also a nice kind of relation between all of this and the sort of experimental take on politics, right? It helps to think about systems relating to environments. It helps to think about this in the same language of the things we were doing before, but it also brings us closer to the idea of looking at all of this process as an experimental process.
Yeah, here there's maybe I don't know if it's far-fetched, but there's maybe a link to reinforcement learning or like artificial intelligence, where there is this way of trying to find situations where your prediction doesn't match the outcome, like actively searching for points where, or areas where the propagate doesn't match what you predicted.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of agency as kind of creating some internal model of the world, then and the environment is giving you feedback, and you're acting in that environment, there can be moments when you act a certain way and the response of the environment does not match your internal model, and that is a moment where you can go towards that to investigate, right?
Yeah,
because obviously it means your model needs to be updated. So you can actually seek out this situation.
Yeah,
those are the areas that cause the most learning to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think you can this would be a really cool kind of topic to explore in detail, because, for example, the guys who work on this, they make a nice little distinction between they say, how do they call it, like what is a do function, what is this propagation function, and what is agency for different things. So for a controller system, the do is like a knob that you change the knob, right? The prop is like a sensor, and the agency is like a control structure, like saying, if you get this sense in the sensor, change that in the knob, like a thermostat, right? Then they add a game here, and they say the do is like a move. No, how do they name it? Yeah, it's like a strategy. The propagation is the reward that you get for that strategy, and the agency is a player. Right? You can already see the difference because a player is allowed to shift strategies depending on the rewards, right? Whereas the controller already has a space of possible changes in the parameter based on the sensor. Like, you cannot change the functions that take you from the sensor back to the knob, right? You can kind of imagine that players have more degrees of freedom than controllers, right? It's almost like the controller is this arrow here is kind of predefined. In the case of the player, a strategy is kind of one arrow, but if the reward doesn't come the way you wanted, you can imagine changing this arrow for a different one, right? Going to a different strategy or different set of strategies, or looking at the game slightly different, right? I think they for learners, I don't remember how they divide it. It's like, I think this is the loss gradient. This is the how do you call it? Like the way you organize the steps in the neural, the weights, right?
Yeah.
And this is some algorithm, right? For correcting the weights based on the loss gradient. It can be ridiculously sophisticated. Like, you can take you get something totally unexpected and it changes the weights in unexpected ways, but it's still ultimately you can feel like there is some constraint on this, like it's meant to do something, right? Or even if it's not clearly stated what it is, it's interesting to think about what is the constraint on this that makes it different from a player and from a controller. And I think that for what we're looking for, which is something else that goes here, you could call it political thinking, you could call it whatever you want. Like we want to call this like interactions with the world, right? What we get back is, I'm not sure how we want to call it, if we want to call it like observation, or because it looks too passive perhaps, right? But there's some reaction. And I think that if this is something to be called, like if this is, let's say, an experiment, right? And the thing that makes this agency is like an idea or something concerned with thinking proper. I think that the difference between this and a game, my intuitive idea for it is that it has something to do with the difference between playing, like changing strategies because you're the player, and changing strategies in the sense that you're being played. Like you're not at the seat, like individuals are not at the seat of players in this. They're more part of the thing being changed to keep with something else that is not you, right? Like you're shifting, like with experiments, you're shifting your perspective away from you towards, for example, the perspective of a hypothesis, towards the sense of the capacity to perceive things of an instrument. There is some sort of displacement that I'm not sure if it's covered by these others. In any case, like it's very interesting to make this distinctions here. We could work on this. It's a cool kind of thing, because ultimately we want to be able to talk about the specificity of this, which should give us the specificity of these things, right? Why are they specific to something like an experimental thing? And I think what Dennis said really goes to the point. Like there's something about like getting as an observation or as a reaction something which makes no sense, and it actually being capable of making it make a difference, right? Like for example, I think that the good example of this perhaps is like the backdrop cosmic noise, right? When you actually pointed the satellite to the space, the noise came from every direction, which is a sort of thing that looks exactly like a interference in the mechanism of the sensor, because it's not directed. You cannot turn the satellite somewhere else and say, okay, now it's gone. Well, if I cannot turn it off and on in any way, it looks like it's the problem in the instrument. And they managed to turn that noise, which you can in no way kind of take out of the picture, into relevant information and say, this is some sort of effect, like from cosmic, I don't know how many billions of years ago, right? Events and things like this. So there is something about the possibility of turning noise into something meaningful, or turning things that don't make a difference into something that makes a difference, that seems more connected with ideas and experiments than it is connected with algorithms, players playing a definite game, or controllers. Like you want that level of amplitude, right? Of what can start counting. And again, it takes us to that idea that you want to intervene. If it's political, you want interventions to make things that didn't count start counting, right? Not simply to confirm that things which did count remain. So I don't know, there's something complicated and interesting at that point there to be better understood, I think. And I think that it connects very nicely, for example, just to Badiou the whole thing a bit, right? You could imagine that this here is where you have something like the statement, like the hypothesis that if there is a site, as Badiou calls it, like something happens here, something that didn't exist exists, right, starts to exist, that this whole thing takes a maximum value. So something that didn't exist exists. That's, let's say, a basic hypothesis. Then this takes you to the points, what he writes like this. You're going to check if things in the situation connect or don't connect with that event. This is the answer to this. Does it connect or does it not? Right? And based on this, you add new statements here to this sort of a space of what else follows from this initial statement. So we say that this exists. We try something out. We see what goes on under that assumption. This allows us to expand the reach of what else we know that also can happen and so on, right? But these are too simplified for our purposes. It's this phi thing that just takes a yes or no answer. I mean, we want to look inside this and know how, let's say, specific situations which bring something inexistent into play constrain the sort of points you can treat, right? This is something that Badiou doesn't talk about. Like, how do you treat points as parameters for choices? And how are those parameters connected with specific sites in the world? So if you're a bunch of people who start a cooperative in Rio, what will count as a point? Should we do this or do that? Is this a path or that path? Should we try this or that? It's different than, I don't know, if you started a little blog of revolutionary ideas, like the sort of things that are meaningful experiments change. So there is, again, a connection between composition and what counts and what makes a difference. So, but you can see that you can start mapping those ideas onto this thing here. So it would be nice to flesh this out, see how far we can take it, right? And Badiou does do something which is interesting, which is he says that he proves pretty much that the set of all positive points, so all investigations, all interventions that take on a yes, right? So if you have here like a object, and you here have the object treated by that point, interacted with under some assumption here, the set of all this interacted with things form a topology. They have an interior, right? And this is not the interior of the process, it's the interior of the world. Like, it creates an oriented, connected part of the world. So you can imagine that the expansion of this is kind of like going from systems to environments, because you're topologically gluing all these interventions together, right? So we could also expand that idea, which is already in Badiou's text. The guy had insights, man. You can say whatever you want, but that he did have. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff to do there. And then the last things, I know we said we would end at 9, but just to conclude, like, the closest thing I found to text that already take this drawing here and try to think about it in terms of instrumentation, observation, intervention, that has that amplitude of experiments, right? Looking for things that didn't make a difference, but if we compose our instruments and our experiments in certain ways, those things can be proved yes or no, proven right, prove hypotheses, prove some conjecture. It's these two texts here. This one by Ben Sprott called Experiments and Theories, a Fundamental Model, which is quite readable. If you don't have any engagement with these theories, I think that this one is a really good one just to introduce to some ideas. And then he presents his basic thesis. And this one, which is ridiculously complicated, a sketch of category theoretic interface for experiment theory relationship. It's less, I think it's less concerned with being like fundamental or going to a really deep point. It's more trying to redescribe very well established books on experiment design and experiment theory in science, with category theory and showing and telling you, look, this is what you would need to redescribe those things, those ideas in categorical terms. So it's doing something more kind of orthodox. It's not trying to give you a fundamental model of the relation between experiments and anything like the first guy. On the other hand, the first guy is quite simple in his presentation, and he definitely doesn't manage to accomplish everything he wanted. I'm not going to the details because I can't really explain to you guys what the hell the details are, as you can see. But I would summarize the contribution of these two texts like this. Like this first guy here, he tries to show that you can treat like it's more it's richer to describe experiments and experimentation as the interaction of two systems, both of them physical systems, where you have a large system and a local system. And there's something about the internal transformations of the large system that are captured by a functor that maps those large transformations into the local transformations inside this small system. And so he's interested in this mapping of mappings, right? And he says, look, this is opening a way to realize that the physics of large systems, or the physics of the world, is actually needs to include the physics of experiments, and the physics of experiments is actually part of a fundamental model, like that experiments can exist. It's actually something that we should think about, and he has interesting ideas there, and I think that there are some cool insights in the text, but it's mostly focused on this issue. Experiments are like small parts of the world they want to learn. You need to be composed in some sense of things that interact with the rest of the world if you want to learn about that world, right? So it touches on things we're interested in, but doesn't really develop them very much. The other text, it's doing something that is kind of like organizing concepts that are well established. Like he focuses on two big manuals of how to do experimental designs in like thermodynamical systems, physics, and whatever. And he just organizes like, how do you relate formally? What is an experimental design? What does it mean to treat, to make an intervention? How those interventions relate to parameters, theoretical parameters? What's the relation between the design of an experiment and events that happen in that experimental space? How does these events relate to the information you have in your theory? And he connects all these things. But then you say, okay, it's pretty much connecting experiments and theories. But even though it's probably more profound than that, if you understand these crazy ways of deriving the structures, which I don't understand, like comma categories and this weird projects and stuff, projections. But it's more like a redescriptive paper and not like one which wants to make a thesis about experiments in general, right? So it might be useful, but those are the only two papers I found on this topic. But it seems like they are nice places to begin if we want to find ways to map the experimental discussion onto our little para-optics machine, right? Then I added as if this is not enough, I'm not going to talk about this now because I think I'm going to try to do a presentation about this later. But I added a bonus research direction after all of this, which is this text here, which I really, really recommend. It's really readable. It has weird letters. There's no way to avoid it. But John Barrow is like a really, really famous logician. He's the only guy besides Badiou and Sartre who developed the theory of situations. He actually has a whole theory of what a situation is, very similar to Badiou, in fact. Badiou quotes him in Being an Event, even. And he's interested in spelling out like it's an old text. There's a lot of things that were done after this, but mostly together, like with the extended mind hypotheses and cognitive science, dealing with this idea of, you know, humans have limited rational capabilities. We delegate reasoning to other systems and to technology and to other mediums. which are better equipped to solve certain problems. Like, for example, counting to 10,000 and using a calculator, right? Or trying to remember how to get somewhere and drawing in the piece of paper, the roads, and so on. What's really cool about this original paper, and it has some insights that are not so clear in the other stuff that I read about the same topic. Like a really good book that touches on this from the cognitive perspective, it's called Cognition in the Wild. I really recommend it. It's an anthropologist who tries to show how a ship thinks, like the crew of a ship, like a big naval thing in the US Marines, how it actually manages to steer the ship and decide where to go. You can't really pinpoint who decides and where. It's like a weird mix of actions by many people and mix of like instruments and people's relations and so on. But what I found very cool about this is that it's a minimal description, very kind of basic formal description, which using this weird concepts here, like a target, a problem, a surrogate domain, the link between the target domain and the surrogate domain, the set of actions you can do on the surrogate domain, and some other concepts. It starts to talk about why is it that certain systems are better to solve a problem than others, or better to make a problem intelligible rather than others. And they don't really give a description of this simply in terms of calculator is better because it computes numbers and it's like it has a battery. It actually looks at the way that the material conformation of some things can, it's really cool. And that's where I said then is that it brings the behavior of meteorology back. The basic idea that they have is this, like, let's just go through this weird image here. Like, like imagine you have this, what they call a target domain, which is like the situation you want to deal with. For every domain, they have like the domain and then a set of classifiers that classify states in that situation. So you have a bunch of stuff happening here, and you have classifiers for what are states of affairs, right? And you have a problem you want to solve, which is defined by some information you already have of that situation that you know to be true, and the space of possibly true other informations about that same situation. Then they say, okay, imagine you have a different system, which is a surrogate just by relation. There is not like it can be the inverse case. So for example, this might be the streets of a city, and this is a piece of paper with a pen. But it might be the inverse. I might be trying to learn something about a piece of paper and a pen by looking at a city. Like it doesn't necessarily, you don't need to know beforehand what is the target and what is the surrogate. But then what he tries to show, I'm not going to go into the details here, but he shows that, for example, these things here might have constraints such that you get information for free if you act here. So for example, one of the examples that they give that I really love is, imagine you're trying to remember where a house was in a neighborhood you lived a long time ago. Like if you try to say it out loud or narrate it with natural language, the constraint you get is that sentences follow one from another, right? Sentence 1, then sentence 2, sentence 3, sentence 4. And you can add any information to any of those. I can start saying, yeah, I lived in Rio de Janeiro in this neighborhood. I remember that there was this guy, this house was near my house, that other house was far away. But this is just the content of the information. The relation between the material utterances doesn't help. But now imagine that I just draw a piece of paper, I draw my streets, then I say, yeah, there was a school here, and there was some other building here. Well, now whatever I want to add is materially constrained. It cannot be here or be here. It needs to either fall here or fall here, right? The two statements I already made, this was here, and the second statement, this is here, materially constrain where I can put things in a piece of paper. So the material constraints of the piece of paper facilitate the reasoning, because it kind of gives me added information that I didn't think of, that drives me towards the solution, right? Well, it's either here or here, because I already put a building here and another here, right? So they're interested in the ways that the different constraints of different systems make them more conductive to certain problems than others. And again, you see how this connects with the idea that composition can make some things more easily intelligible than in other situations, right? So it's a really cool paper. It's not that hard to read. It's kind of it has really good examples, and but it's kind of out of how to say, outdated. There is more research being done now, but most of it's not really formal in this way. But there's a lot of interesting stuff being done on top of this, and it seems to have a nice connection with behavioral meteorology, because we want to talk about constraints in our social description of worlds, right? So the fact that Bauerweiss theory of constraints is so central to his theory of thinking, right, of problem solving, or whatever you want to call it, seems like a connection that brings behavioral meteorology as a relevant thing in what we're calling these experiments, right? The sort of constraints that you experience in an organization can make it more conductive for you to think through certain problems in that organization than somewhere else. So for example, it's much easier to never face problems concerning social reproduction if you're a group of 5 men that meet, in a public university classroom. You don't play for the room, you don't have to do anything, and so on. Right? Whereas if you're organizing in some other situation, certain problems will come to the fore, and the way that you formulate your political strategy will more likely have to deal with those problems. So you can actually, again, track the correspondence of concrete social problems, how they affect composition, and how that affects intelligibility, right? And you can say that you're delegating some type of reasoning or some type of problem typification or problem intelligibility to the organization, problems that wouldn't appear if you were only individually constrained, right? Yeah, so I mean, we just need to read all of this, understand everything,
yeah,
and then we're done.
Yeah, I agree with you on this last part. The behavioral meteorology seems to fit really well here in terms of like that functor you showed between the large system in that simple model of the experiment, right? You have this large system, like, I don't know, stars in space or something, and then you have this smaller system like a telescope, and then you have this functor which maps states in the larger system to states in the smaller system, and then based on that map you kind of construct this theory, right? And that can also be redescribed in terms of constraints, because there are some constraints in outer space governing the development of stars, and there are some constraints in the lens of the telescope that or your eye even, and the kind of data you can record from by looking at the sky, and then a theory is something which arises when we try to pass those constraints from one to the other. We make a link and say the constraints in one became the constraints in this other system.
Yeah, I think that the example that he gives is really good. He says, like, you want to understand, you have hypotheses concerning the fact that spiral galaxies are formed, like they're younger, right? And that they start like this mass, more amorphous ones, and then it becomes formed. You have you're already aware of the fact that light travels at a certain speed, meaning that light gets to you after a couple, some time has passed. Mm-hmm. With that hypothesis, premise, you can turn your telescope to like you can zoom in further into space, and you should see more of these amorphous galaxies. And when you zoom out to a space that is closer to you, you should see more spiraled galaxies. If that zooming out and in the instrument that correlates with seeing more amorphous and then seeing more spiral, if you have a theory that can, if your theory has the principle that what's closer to you is the light that has traveled, no, it's the inverse, right? The light that has traveled the most.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, the amorphous is further away because it's the older galaxies, right?
Yeah, so the older, but then it's the inverse, right? The older galaxies, the one that had time. No, they're still the old ones, like they're in the past, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are in the past. Yeah, so the amorphous ones are in the past, and the spiraled ones are more in the present. So I can correlate the transformation of past to present in the galaxy system with the transformation in the zoom in and zoom out in the instrument, right?
Yeah, zoom in and zoom out is a nice like knob, like that's our parameter space, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then the propagate is the how spiral is the galaxy.
Yeah, is a distribution of spiral galaxies increase or decrease, right?
That's the propagate, yeah.
Yeah, that's the propagate, and then in the parameter space you have what zoom changes will you do, and what are you expecting to see based on the premise that older galaxies are amorphous and young, and in time they become spiral, right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it would be a problem to redescribe that experiment that Sprott presents in the paper in terms of the surrogate reason. Like it seems like one thing could serve the purpose of the other, you know?
Yeah, it seems very inspired by it, or like,
yeah.
I don't know if he quotes it, but it's
no. It's totally
independent. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, I can think of other stuff that I think fits the same thing. For example, Robert Rosen's ideas. He has something that goes in a similar direction, but it seems like all these things, they kind of foment this idea of, you know, treating this sort of space of constraints of an instrumental organization as something that gets to interact with a larger unknown environment under certain parameters that can be changed by what you observe or the reaction of that environment. And all of this is described in a way that we can talk about how a local version of this gets to compose with other experiments, and then you can treat that as a larger thing. We could start talking about, let's say, how much do organizations need to share in terms of their parameters or their hypotheses to be able to compose together in some way, right? I think it's something Dennis and I were talking about. Like it's not difficult to see a situation where it's actually quite interesting that you get very separate strands of hypotheses to be tested that are incompatible with one another. But if you go up to a more abstract premise, they agree with one another, you know, and they're just exploring like branches quite further out. So you could have like a very heterogeneous kind of directions of investigation, and they're not necessarily in total. They are in tension with one another, but they're not totally contradictory, because you can find a point inside the process within which they agree, right? I think that's actually a really good distinction between a tensed organization or tensed organizational ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, and a scission, a proper scission in politics, in a more profound sense, which is, if you look at organizations that took different principles and they are exploring them, if the point of envelope of the two strands still falls inside the political process. They're just different branches of politics in tension with one another. If the envelope falls outside of the political process in an object in the world, like they are all students, it's just like different political movements of students. They hate each other. They don't agree in anything. They don't compose in any premise. There's no strategic point of view which includes both of them. What includes both of them is the social objects that they form under regular conditions, right? They're all part of the student body. Then you can say that a scission happened and they are separate processes. But if that envelope point happens inside the struggle, right? For example, the anti-fascist delivery movement and treta no trampo, for example. You can say they are going there different ways, but it makes no sense to say that the envelope is outside of the political process, like what they have in common, right? So you can actually start making that nice distinctions, I think.
Yeah, along those lines, also, I think the resource sharing is important, because a lot of times when we talk about these envelopes, we think of them in kind of like an abstract way, kind of saying like, okay, do these things belong together? Well, how do you prove that two things belong together? If I think a concrete way is to say, do they share the same resources? Like in terms of political movements, you could say like, do they share the same people, right? As a simple resource, the same kind of support, right? Like, I don't know, what are the concrete things that these two, even if they disagree on something, what are the set of things that they are constrained by, right? Like if you have a village that everyone there in the village shares, I don't know, like a lake for fishing. It doesn't matter if the village itself disagree, the members of the village might disagree on some point of how to react to, let's say there's some dumping happening in this lake. A company's coming in and dumping chemicals into the lake. So some part of the village might think, well, this company is bringing jobs, so we need it for economic growth. The other part of the village thinks, no, well, the lake is our livelihood, and so on. Well, what ties the two parts of the village is that they both still depend on this lake, right? So you can, I feel like the resource is a concrete way of describing the envelope.
Yeah, but you see, I agree with you. It's a concrete way of doing it, but in the way you just did it, I think we could make the distinction. For example, under the premises we're working on, what would constitute something as a political thing, constraint, rather than a social one? The political one is the case where the existence of what's going on depends on the existence of something that didn't exist before being maintained, right? Like this meeting only has meaning because we are committed to the fact that something that doesn't have a place in the world should have, right? So that in existence gives, we depend on it for this other thing to have a degree of existence of its own. But the thing we depend on might not depend on this in existence. So the lake is there, it's true, everyone depends on it, but as a common resource, not in the same sense that, for example, the Khrushchev report destroying, let's say, the Soviet Union's legitimacy actually destroyed the legitimacy of a bunch of meetings that were happening throughout the whole world that were kind of dependent on its relevance to be relevant themselves. The moment that that thing falls, those things also lose their relevance. Like the common envelope is actually itself political, right? It can happen that it's not. And I even think that that's actually a definition of what's been called cosmopolitics. Cosmopolitics, the sort of politics of the environment, politics of Gaia, it trusts that the planet Earth is the common envelope of all struggles. Like you can just trust that it's not, let's say, gonna be destroyed or made illegitimate by our disagreements. Ultimately, it's a resource we all depend on, right?
Yeah.
So we can make that difference as well between, is the common point of these separate branches inside itself dependent on an event or whatever you want to call it, right? Or is that common point prior to it and kind of indifferent to it?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because yeah, I mean, in this case, the lake is an existent thing, right?
Yeah, it exists, right?
It exists, yeah.
But for example, saying that we can manage natural resources better than through state and capital private ownership, that doesn't exist, right? But that's an operation on the status of the lake. It's not exactly the same thing as the lake, right? It's like, it's the all lives matter to the Black Lives Matter difference. Like, yeah, factually, yes, lives of everyone, that's the common resource. But you're going a bit like it's a way of depoliticizing at the same time that it tries to conciliate these different branches, right?
Yeah, I think this is maybe we found a new way to address it, but I think this is a hard problem to solve because, yeah, like there's always a temptation to find something like that is more universally recognizable as an envelope.
Yeah.
To hold together the points, right? Like, how do you hold together the body? You need something like that has some existence to do that.
Yeah,
like
but for example,
organs have existence, right?
Yeah, but I think in cognitive science today we have a good example of this difference. Like the established vision of theory of consciousness in scientific thinking until recently was that we would explain it away in a more reductionist way, right? At some point, a bunch of different theories that are less reductive, that are more correlational or like axiomatic, like IET and so on appear. They don't agree in many things, like the global workspace theory, but they're all kind of enveloped by the fact that they are not reductionist in a certain common sense that was around until some point. Like their intention, it might be even a productive tension in some sense. They don't agree amongst each other, but you can't really look at the, let's say, stable, neutral statement to find their common point. Like if you go up enough, looking for this objective common thing, you will actually lose the object that they're treating. Like because the neutral common statement is that object doesn't exist.
Oh wait, yeah. But now that I think about it, it's only in using Badiou's definition, only the very top of this lattice, let's say, is the inexistent. But along the way, you have these envelopes that don't have to be inexistent themselves, right?
Yeah, but this is the point. Like, I mean, from what I understand, the way that this lattice of experiments would look like is that for him, this topology preserves conjunctions and envelopes from the world. So, for example, it's not like cars are no longer cars and roads are no longer roads. But if you have like a new ecological policy against private transportation, some collections of cars together, or the value of the bus or other forms of transportation, become higher than before. So I think you have a part of it which is preserving a lot of information about the world, but then experiments are never just about preserving, right? It's always like something plus something slightly different. So it's never just the inexistence is the top, but every experiment needs to have a mixture of things plus the inexistent, like something that didn't exist. It cannot just have already existing stuff on its own, right?
Yeah, I see.
Like, so if you remove that inexistent dimension that you added to the picture, they just look like like you're just making veridical statements, right? No longer as if you're trying to say, okay, if that thing there exists, how about this thing here? Like if this crazy cooperative exists, how meaningful is this meeting of these workers in this other place now, wondering if they shouldn't create a cooperative, right? I mean, if the cooperative doesn't exist, that meeting, well, it exists, but it's no longer at stake the same thing, right? So it trickles down to the other things, right?
Yeah, I definitely believe that the inexistent is always kind of there in the background, and I'm just wondering if the way we think about enveloping could be combined with this resource sharing in a better way, so that the actual economic activity of the two parts that are now dividing on some point have something tying them together, right? Something that is,
yeah. But I think that
something has to circulate between them.
Yeah, but I think that you're treating this as a descriptive, but it might be a prescriptive point. Like it might not be a matter of, well, this is already the case. Well, because it is true in some sense, right? All movements, all political movements in the city are sharing the air. Therefore, they share things like pollution or security in some sense, right?
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is actually the inverse. It's more prescriptive. Like the more resource sharing circuits you have, the more lower envelopes you will have other than the inexistent, right? It's an idea for a strategy. Like the more social movements that don't get along share resources, the more you will be able to find envelopes of their common points that doesn't need to go all the way back to like general principle, but that's a prescription that you're proposing. Like you're solving the problem. You're not describing the problem.
Yeah, I see. So the problem itself is you have these kind of hypotheses that can't be or can be resolved in two different ways or more than one way, right? But
yeah,
but what I'm saying is the way of joining these different answers to the hypotheses could be interpreted as a kind of resource.
Yeah, I mean, imagine something like, okay, you have like this very general principle, like this gives rise to an organization and another organization. And then let's say this splits right into a new organization here, tree, and splits into this. And then this one here split, like has a bunch of other processes that now have nothing to do with this, right? The strands never agree on. Like, for example, you could have the case where these two here agree on this one. But we're talking about a situation where suddenly, though they agree on this very general principle, like socialism is interesting and should be pursued, this whole set of organizations here doesn't have any point of agreement with this whole set of organizations here, right? And we're saying that, of course, like, if you don't find any point of agreement, you could even say that it comes to the point where, I don't know, this one here imagines these different principles and no longer even agrees on principle with the other one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the most extreme case.
Yeah, and we can say, well, but when this happens, there's still some resource that is actually, let me write it differently. Like, there's still some resource here that is actually at stake here, is at stake here, right? They all share this resource. So it actually provides an envelope to bind them together. But now the argument we were making is that if this resource exists objectively, regardless of political principles, you're not really connecting these things together, because these resources are like a lake dividing a group of civil society that doesn't care for protecting it and a group that cares. It's bound at a level that doesn't really
yeah,
It's
No,
not
I
internal, right?
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think what I'm trying to say here is like all not all resources are political
Yeah, no,
in
definitely.
existence, but all political statements are resources.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. So like what I think you meant is like imagine that you have a clearer view of resources that are at this level, and they are here and here, for example, right? Some organization is concerned with building common resources between organizations. These resources are themselves based on this principle, right? We created this like a society for people who care for the lake. And some people who are in the separate branch, they're actually part of that. They don't agree with, they go to the meetings to piss on the other people who want to engage politically with the thing. But the fact is that now you have a resource that is an envelope at this level inside the process, rather than an envelope resource that is an envelope at this outer level, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like I'm just saying that the principle is also a resource. So I mean, there's no need to like draw them differently, like P at the top and R below, because isn't it just simply a slogan, kind of a resource in a way?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think the meme thing actually could be totally kind of described here, right?
Yeah, exactly. A meme is a resource because it's something that you share that has some kind of common recognizable form, right? That you can kind of exchange with one another, treat it as currency. But then you can also think of ways that even something like a meme can degrade. For example, when it's co-opted by some other group, then
yeah,
you no longer can use that resource. I don't know.
Yeah, and the meme has an issue as well, which is that it's a resource that you never, because it doesn't really have a classical relation to scarcity. It never requires you to go back to it, right? I mean, it seems like it's available infinitely until the moment that it's no longer available, right? I mean,
yeah, it's not scarce, but it can be destroyed or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that it doesn't, it's not so it's conducted to a one way of organizing around it, and it circulates, it creates this sort of envelope because it's a common resource to all of that. But it's not, let's say, the same thing as, for example, I'm not sure, like having a printing press that many different organizations that hate each other use.
Yeah.
Right. The level of, let's say, encroachment of that resource on these organizations is larger than the level of, right, the level of imbrication of the meme with the different things that is certainly like it seems like the very thing that makes the meme good, which is it's light, right? It doesn't require great engagement, so it composes ubiquitously. Also makes it kind of you cannot benefit from it being heavy, right? From the fact that it's very encroached in the organization, so it's not an envelope you can let go so easily. So you're stuck with others if you share more complicated resources, right?
Yeah. You kind of see that with like, you might take a slogan, but then like some other group does something in the name of that slogan that completely misrepresents your position, something like that. Right?
Yeah, and you can just drop the slogan at that point, right? It's not like you're stuck with them and then you still need to work around it or do something or respond to it. That tension is easily dispelled if you just let it go as well. So, but I don't know. I think that there's a lot of stuff there that makes sense, you know.
Yeah, I was thinking how also like, because I also feel there's this, it feels a bit discontinuous the way like how like an organization materially reproduces. So there are the conditions for reproductions are like of social nature, but at the political level, like what it defends, what it thinks is seems to be like a different kind of resource, like maybe like a tradition that it affiliates itself, that and the way it relates to like other movements in history. So I don't know if this can be treated as a resource also, like the way that you know, that you only feel that what you're doing makes sense, not too much because like you're meeting with people, there's like an end to it, but you justify it through like a certain like political idea, and that like you know what I mean? Like
I see what you mean, but like this is where I think Badiou is really good in his very vulgar materialism, because I agreed with the idea that principles are resources, but now I kind of disagree. I think because I think like for speaking about ideas is a resource. It's materially bounded. It you know, like it's situated. It's here and not there. It can be depleted. It's not the fact that it's scarce in the sense that it's almost about to be depleted. It can be infinite, but still be situated. Like you could invent a machine where we can speak forever, but it still is, you know, here and not there at some point. Like I think that's a relevant thing. Like an idea on a book might be a resource, but ideas like free floating in a way that their transmission doesn't change anything, their repetition doesn't change anything, you know, like their reproduction cost is zero, makes them, I wonder if like we want to treat them the same way we would treat like water, air.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I mean, and this is, I think goes well with Badiou, because for him, ultimately, like you want to find ideas in the form of stuff we're doing, right? And not in the way we speak. So, but I don't think it changes the point that you guys were making. Like, I totally agree. And I think that this is actually where this approach goes to ultimately, because this is what we're ultimately saying. Like, if composition affects intelligibility and capacity for interaction, and composition has to do with resources, social reproduction of organizations is materially conditioning of your actual political platform, right? Not political theory, but what you're actually capable of doing. And from the set of ideas you defend, the ones that will have efficacy, it's actually conditioned by the social reproduction of the organization, the way it's composed, what constraints it's under, right? What it shares with other parts of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And this composition, tying it back to the thing we said, like it costs something to see something, right? Mm-hmm. What is the cost? I think the cost is the cost of reproduction in a way. Like if you want to sense something really complicated, you probably need to be composed in a really complicated way. Mm-hmm. Meaning you have to pay a higher cost to continue sensing it. So you have kind of a fragility to the organization.
Yeah.
To sense certain things, but whereas like very simple things, if you want to sense it, you don't need to. But even like social reproduction, is complicated because.
You know, like this is, I love this because this allows us to say something I always wanted to say, but I think ethics is cost-free cost-free politics is ethics. Like, right, the politics reduced to simple components, like I'm here, things that happen to me, things that I act as a person. That's what we call the world of ethics, right? That's why, like the underlying difficulty with ethics is that it's very hard to include into ethical behavior the possibility that what you do locally is not conducive to what happens globally. You need it. It's a thinking, like from its religious basis to morality and so on. It's very, very connected to the idea that everything that is accessible to me simply as an individual is what I need to create effects at a complex level, right? At a social level. If you behave good, society is good, right? That sort of thing. Yeah, it's very hard to encompass. I mean, that's a whole problem with structural analysis of capitalism. To say you can have a bunch of honest people and the aggregated effect socially actually doesn't go in that direction honesty and justice and things like this, right? So I think that there's a nice thing to that, like politics, I think, begins when you start having to add costs and this sort of trade-offs to create some level, some type of entity, which is actually at the level of the decisions you want to make, right? If you don't need to make any of that, that's actually the sort of question we call ethical questions, like, what should I do? How should I behave? What should I understand? Even if it's very sophisticated, it's still kind of situated in that way, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I think there's this weird kind of constraint or maybe cognitive mapping problem there, because at some point the level of decision making, it stops mapping to the individual, right? So you kind of run into this doubt, right? You run into a doubt that, like, is this really the ethical thing to do? Or like, how do you maintain your principles? How does an organization maintain its principles? But usually you find this issue of, like, you want to get more influence, but to get more influence, you're like forced to play some game that is like, doesn't map to some individual ethical system, right?
Yeah.
And that becomes a problem, right? That's a scaling problem, because at the same time you need a certain amount of trust in the ethical position as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to say that ethics doesn't exist. It's just that you can actually perhaps describe its scope a bit better,
Exactly.
And there are, I mean, it's a nice kind of theory of, it's a theory, it does for ethics what complex numbers do for numbers, because you have, ethical and unethical behavior, and then you have complex behavior, which is in this other line, which is neither ethical or unethical. It's just not of that kind of register.
Yeah, it actually helps you raise ethics further, because you want to say, like, how do we map ethical into more complex, right? So that looks different. Like that isn't going to be some intuitive first person picture.
Yeah, I like this. I think there's, but Badiou, in his books on ethics, he has, like, if you read it carefully, one of his theses is that fascism is trying to kind of simulate political processes at the level of, recognizable ethical attitudes. Like, if you try to reduce complex political processes, which are not about you, to something that is actually recognizable at this transitive level with the local, that's a sort of simulacra of politics, right? Like, so
it's a crazy definition.
Yeah, he has two crazy definitions. That one, and in the theory of the subject, he has this one-liner that ethics is the remains of politics. Like, you do politics, and then, like, once it's over, there are, like, minor questions that you need to, like, clean the room, say bye to the guests and so on, and that's like the ethical part of life. So yeah, he has a weird relationship to, like, defining the field of ethics, which I think is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, but yeah, I think here, if we think about this resource, when we try to take points and resources and we try to map them or consider them as the same, I think now we can really talk about constraints. We can talk about treating points, because I think Badiou leaves out a lot of details of what does it mean to treat a point, right?
Yeah.
You give some examples, but I think it would be nice to talk about treating points in terms of the constraints of a resource, like somehow working with the constraints of some resource that you're sharing, even if you may not agree with everyone or all parties agree. There is something in common, a resource that puts a constraint on both parties. That's what allows the possibility of an envelope, even if that resource is something like a principle, right? It's a constraint that like if you have a principle, but it doesn't actually constrain any behavior, then it's nothing, right? It's not really.
Yeah.
But I still feel
I don't know.
there might be like this dualism in the resource sharing machines between resources and what he calls like something like actions or like directional. I feel there is also maybe like a meaningful distinction still between like social reproduction and political action that might be relevant. Like one thing I was thinking like how to formalize was I agree that there's this level of how social composition like constrains what we're able to do in terms of like resources, but there's like coming back to the memes and gestures, there seems to be like this other dimension on how like gestures are like can become like recognizable by learning about its efficacy in like interventions. They start to become like they stop being just gestures, like singular like gestures, and they start to be like social forms of this passage from like singular actions to like social forms seems to be what politics is about, like and the way it ultimately will become some form of like social reproduction, I think. But at the beginning, I think political action is about like creating like like coming up with certain behaviors that we don't know what they are, and then the moment we learn about it efficacy and it does something, and it's also not co-opted or like reintegrated into something like to capitalism, then it might become part of like the social reproduction machine of a movement.
You know, now that you say this actually touches on something that I didn't realize before, but it's very important, which is if you look in logics of worlds, like you can talk about undirected composition and directed composition. Like undirected composition is atomic logic. Like if I say this I don't know, glass is on top of the water, if I localize the glass on the table, like the glass of water is on the table, I'm also localizing the table with regards to the glass of water. It's not directed. It's like every direction all at the same time. But when I talk about relations, modifications, and change, then it's directed. Something was one way, becomes another. I can talk about the process, the initial state, and the output of that. When you get to the political process for Badiou, the arrows, the path inverts. First, you have points, which are directed. You treat something, and it becomes something else. And then you have compatibility and, let's say, the sort of pseudo-atomic logic or the subjective atomic logic, right? How do these interventions compose together? So in the description of the world, resource comes first, machines come second. And in the case of political description or subjective description, machines come first and resources come second, which I think is what you were saying, right? Gestures become starts as a localized action, right? But then it becomes the thing that you can compose, and no longer in a directed way, it just becomes a thing that exists, right?
Yeah.
It seems relevant in some way.
Yeah, like a strike fund, initially it's just like an action you do to solve like a localized problem of how to and then it eventually can become like a part of like the reproduction of it becomes a thing on itself, right?
Yeah. And I think that this goes back to the distinction we were making when Dennis first talked about the issue of resources, and this. Let's distinguish between social resources, meaning common parts of the political process that were already there, and you can remove the political existence and they remain existing. So they would be like social resources, like nature and so on, and political resources, which are those that if you remove the politics, you lose them as well. Right?
Okay, yeah.
Right. I mean, the strike fund is a good example of a political resource in the sense that it was created as a point, as an intervention. then it becomes available for composition and becomes a resource, but it's sustained on the point. It's sustained on the idea of a strike. If you remove the idea of strikes, you lose the strike fund as well. So we can make the distinction between, let's say, political resources and social resources, right? And even think of them in terms of partitions. Like if you can partition the world and remove the politics, and that resource remains, you can call it a social resource, right? And if you partition the world and take the political organizations out, and that resource disappears together, then it's a political resource, right? It's implicated in the process, right?
Yeah, in that sense, politics becomes this like creation of resources that are not part of the world, right? Like they're, like you said, I mean, it actually fits perfectly with the whole equation of the formula of the existence of X depends on the existence of the inexistent, right? So
yeah.
The dependence is maximal between X and the inexistent.
Yeah.
So it's exactly like a political resource is one where its existence depends fully on the political process itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, the crazy thing about it is the idea that even though it looks more frail in the sense that it's not grounded on pure social reproduction of the world, in some sense, it's actually more available as a resource than the lake, right? So like the lake is a resource that by sharing the lake, you're not necessarily sharing this political body, right? It doesn't go together with the lake. Whereas if you're sharing the strike fund, even if you don't care, you are sharing now in the political process. Like, for example, these guys who do the collective investment groups here in Brazil, this movement of the popular communities, MCP, they go to different places and they create this kind of social funds. People who live in like a slum or somewhere, they give a bit of money and they do like loans. I think I talked to you about this, Dennis, already. Like they have this very sophisticated, very interesting kind of way of doing loans. And if you put your money there, you get some interest back and so on. It only exists under the premise that, you know, communities can self-organize. It's illegal. Banks cannot, they don't offer credit to those people because they don't have like social identity and cards and things like this. So that is an economic resource that people share, like the possibility of you know, taking a loan or putting your money in a place where you get some interest back on your investment there, right? And it's connecting all these different activities in such a way that even if you don't share politically the idea, if you put your money there, you're actually sharing that political resource, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
I think that's where I think we should try to go investigate, because that's feels more robust than like just simply saying that these two things belong together because some abstract principle binds them, right?
Yeah, that's why I meant like I don't think the principles should qualify as resources if they appear like in abstract, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
I mean, you can do the partition text with philosophical political ideas. You can remove the whole world and they remain the principle. Therefore, they don't belong to the world, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So they're not really.
There needs to be.
Yeah.
It needs to be that dependence in some material sense, even if it's not social reproduction, but there's some kind of I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
material existence.
Yeah, you can derive the reason why the more this resource is both caught up with the inexistent and with the reproduction of objects in a world, right? So, for example, if it's a hospital, but it only exists because people there are working in some way together, blah, blah, blah. So the form of it is self-managerial, for example, but it is in a place where no hospital would be placed, but it's deeply connected with the reproduction of people in the region. of course, the more it's entrenched in the social reproduction of people, the more robust it will be in terms of being one of these envelopes that you can trust, even if for myriad of reasons, things that develop from it are quite separate, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, and if you look at, I mean, most of the time that's how you can trace it back to things like that, where it's like fighting over land or, I mean, land is separable, like you can separate it from the political process, but there is something like maybe ownership of the land or something that's whether those who are indigenous to that land have rights to the land, or if it's the land is itself a commodity that can be bought and sold to anyone, that would be like a point, I think.
Yeah, because I think this is the point. Like, the weird thing is that ultimately political resources are more common than social resources. Like, not common in the sense that they exist in more profusion, but in the sense that it's actually quite ideological to, for example, to claim that a lake is common resource, because it's not common, right? I mean, even in the best case scenario, it's common to a population around the lake. But for example, association of friends of the lake who are getting together to decide what to do with the lake, it's more likely to accept people who live away from the lake than the lake itself. So, I mean, politicizing something actually gives that resource a chance of being the common part of many parts, more than just trusting, let's say, natural resources on their own, for example.
Yeah, that's also maybe a secondary question, but it's how do regular resources become caught up in this process and become politicized? And like you said, it's usually in the sense of like who has access to it or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a big topic, really cool topic. I unfortunately, we didn't manage to keep it to 9 o'clock, like to.
Okay,
it's a regular time, but I need to go, man. I need to cook. I'll stay with your question in mind.
I'll think about it too. We can resume on. This is also a good segue because I wanted to present on
Ostrom,
the
right?
commons, and Ostrom and the commons
perfect.
next time. So this is
great.
Planned it perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, guys. See you.
Take care, everyone.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.